The living room is where you make life's most beautiful memories. But your sofa shouldn't be the one remembering them. The new life-resistant, high-performance furniture collection from Ashley is designed to withstand all the spills, slip-ups, and muddy paws that come with the best parts of life. Ashley high-performance sofas and recliners are soft, on-trend, and easy to clean. Shop the high-performance furniture in-store or online at ashley.com. Ashley, for the love of home.
So when we begin to ask about this universe and what it's up to, we have no other perspective from which to operate than our own experience. You are not an exception to this universe. You are an exemplification of its deepest nature and its structure. To use this soil metaphor, right?
Whoa.
We are a plant that has grown out of the soil of the universe. We are a product of what the universe is doing. And when we begin to see that, we begin to see that our experience is, well, a part of us. It's more than us. It's connected to the vast unfolding cosmos of which we are part. So to the extent the meaning crisis is linked in feelings of isolation, feelings of decentering from each other, from God, from the universe itself, I think it helps to remind us that there is nothing else that we can be but this universe expressing itself.
Welcome to the Liminal Living Podcast. I am Dr. Tom Rundell, your curator of conversations. And on this podcast, we like to have conversations around the liminal spaces in our faith. And most of the time, we're going to talk about dark nights and deconstructions because that is a thing that's happening in a big way. Sometimes we're going to talk about shifting theology, maybe some things socially or politically that's going on in our world. But today is different. Today is special. Today we talk with Dr. Andrew M. Davis, American process philosopher, theologian, and scholar of cosmological wonder, taken directly from his website. He's the program director for the Center for Process Studies, where he researches, writes, teaches, and organizes conferences on various aspects of process-relational thought. I've been looking into this process, open relational view of God lately, talking with some folks like Dr. Thomas Oord, next week with Josh Patterson, and today with Dr. Andrew M. Davis. He's written a lot of academic articles and books around this topic, and today we're going to talk about one of his books, and it is a thick book, as the kids like to say. This book is called The Metaphysics of Exo-Life. Whoa. I mean, that's big. The subtitle is Toward a Constructive Whiteheadian Cosmotheology. But please do not let that title scare you away. This is one of the most fun conversations that I think I've had on this. And that's saying a lot because I've had some fun ones. This one felt more like talking theology and philosophy with one of my favorite science fiction authors. That's how this one felt. And the topics that we cover, it ranges from personal faith journey to philosophy to theology to astronomy. We ask big questions like if our theological framework was developed in medieval times under a earth-centric understanding of the universe, how is that going to change with the discovery of near infinite galaxies out there in the universe? What does a Christian faith look like that's not so earth-centric or even human-centric? If there is intelligent life on other planets, what is the role of God in their social constructs? And what does that do to the doctrine of the incarnation, God becoming human, or the doctrine of the second coming, where God comes to earth to establish the kingdom of God? So, if intelligent life, alien life, made itself known to us, what theologies are going to be thrown out the window? You can see we get real nerdy real fast, and it's fun. So as Samuel L. Jackson once said in Jurassic Park, hold on to your butts. I think you're going to enjoy my conversation with Dr. Andrew Davis. Well, Dr. Andrew Davis, welcome to the Liminal Living Podcast. It's good to have you on here today.
Thanks for having me, Tom. Looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, this discussion is a miracle that it's happening because we got dumped on with 6 inches of snow last night, and luckily I thought ahead and brought all my gear home. And so you might hear dogs barking. Amazing. Or, various household things going on in the background. I don't have a studio, so we're going to give it, I'm but I wanted this one to happen so bad. I'm like, I'm taking this stuff home.
Well, you're coming through loud and clear, and if that's the case, then we're at least positioned to do okay then.
I think so. Everything's working, so I'm happy. Now,
Perfect.
you recently visited Germany. We had to. I wanted to have this conversation sooner because I was so excited to talk to you. But you're like, I got to go to Germany first. So you went there and you did. I got a really long title of what you did or where you went. I don't know if it's a what or a where, but you were at a psychological research project for philosophers and theologians, which is a mouthful. But my pressing question was, how was the beer?
Yes, the more pressing question.
Yeah.
Well, the beer is great. I had a number of Helles beers, as they call them. Very delicious. I'm in California here, so we're used to the IPAs, these very heavily alcoholic, if you want, beverages. And there's less of that in Munich, but the beers there are fantastic across the board. A little lighter in tone than I'm used to, but yeah, just a wonderful spot. Just a word, I suppose, about the program there. It's a Templeton-sponsored program, a cross-training program, really, in psychology that's aimed for philosophers and theologians, with the aim of helping philosophers and theologians be more akin to psychological research and methods in psychological research. So we can take that into our work in the development of philosophical counseling, development of philosophical practice. So this is a small cohort that I've joined there, and it was an inaugural session in Munich. And then throughout the next year here, I meet with a Munich group once a week to dive into this content and how it affects all the research that we're doing. So it should be an interesting year. Looking forward to it quite a bit.
Yeah,
but yeah, Munich is wonderful. Have you been there by chance? Have you had a chance to visit Munich?
No, I've never crossed the pond. Actually, I've gone south to Central America and some islands down there, but I have never crossed the pond. I'd like to.
Got it. I hope you do.
Well, it sounds like there's a lot of multidisciplinary things going on there with the crossing of philosophy, theology, psychology. And I'm teaching philosophy to a bunch of high schoolers starting tomorrow's my first day, actually. And so it's fun. And it's fun to realize, like, before science nails down on something, like, it started off with philosophy. And so it's cool to see, like, how philosophy can then take and, like, chart new courses in these areas of theology and psychology and, like, do a multidisciplinary thing. That's really cool. And I'm glad you're there because I read your book and it was like, wow, these are thoughts we need to be having in modern day times. But before we get to your book, I would like to know a little bit about you and what kind of soil did you grow out of, and did faith play a role in your development at all?
Yeah, it certainly did. So, I was raised here in Santa Rosa, California. We're just 60 miles north of San Francisco. And I would say, I love that language of soil too, right? It's appropriate because you grow out of this soil. So the soil that I was nurtured in terms of faith is an evangelical Protestant soil. So my schooling, my church background, my upbringing was pretty conservative evangelical, at least on my mom's side. She was the foundation of my childhood faith in a certain way, although she had a certain rebellion about her, which was nice. For example, never really liking this notion of an eternal hell, but not quite sure what to do with it, type of thing. Whereas my dad is much more the intellectual foundation of my faith, and that side sort of emerged gradually as I came up. But I just took it for granted that the world was, I think, in my youth, basically the way that my evangelical teachers told me it was, but I also had a rebellious side too. I was never quite content with simple, easy answers or literal reading, say, of scripture. So I enjoyed Bible class. I enjoyed theology class because it was a space to ask questions. It was a space where it seemed that things were not quite ultimately settled. And I think I benefited from teachers that were open to having those conversations. And it's fun to hear you say you're teaching high school kids, because after at least my master's work at Claremont, I returned to my old high school myself as a teacher, and I taught world philosophies, theology, biblical studies. And it was a unique experience because I was teaching myself. I saw myself in these kids at this young time. And one of the first things that I emphasize is that, we're going to be asking some really important questions in this class. And we're going to not just regurgitate answers we've been given. We want to really think about these things and try to connect it to the sciences and to philosophy and to these different domains of human experience and human discipline. So it was really a rich experience. But I did emerge out of the evangelical soil. In part, I still have a foot in that soil. I still have a lot of friends and colleagues that are in that world that I love and appreciate. And while I don't see the world precisely the way they do, there's still a space for affirming what's good in that tradition. And I think certainly others could say that about different religious traditions. So, but my sort of climb out of that soil was through reading and research, was through travel, was through witnessing the wisdom of various different traditions, and then circling back and saying, well, what does that mean for the ways in which I was raised? So I have appreciation for that soil, but it's not the only soil, and other flowers and gardens are growing out of different soils. I think it's important for us to see that and to acknowledge and appreciate that in a deep sense.
Would you say that you're in a specific camp currently, or do you kind of see yourself more as a mutt?
Well, no, I have no problem saying that I inhabit the Christian tradition. It's just that the evangelical soil out of which one expression of that tradition is expressed is more narrow, right? So I do think it's important to see the Christian tradition as a vast current that is flowing. It's to use the metaphor again, there's different areas of the Christian garden, the soil, which has more nutrients than others, right? So I think there's a lot more to the Christian tradition philosophically, theologically, than just an evangelical persuasion. And to the extent that we're not making that known, I think we are doing a disservice to the Christian tradition. So we have a lot of folks these days exploring Eastern Orthodox modes of thought, as opposed to just Western, say, Augustinian modes of thought, mystical strains that are belonging to the Christian tradition as well. So these are all a part of the depth of the soil, and I think we can miss that if we just limit our Christian identity, say, to one expression. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. And I think there's, last count, 40,000 different Christian denominations. And I think a good 3/4 of them think they got it right. So
yeah, well, the irony is it's especially this more fundamentalist form, which was a part of my upbringing too, to a certain extent, which is incredibly modern. I mean, we're talking about a vast historical tradition, at the top of which is this strange expression we call evangelical or fundamentalist faith. This is not the heart of faith, I would say. It's certainly not Christian faith.
Do you remember, like, there was a specific question, or maybe just a question that seemed bigger than the others that you really wrestled with, that kind of broke you through to a new way of seeing or thinking?
It's so hard to say, because I think my awakening as a philosopher really was gradual. So I initially I had an interest in biblical studies at Point Loma Nazarene University, an interest in historical theology, and then much more philosophical theology and metaphysics as my sort of journey continued at graduate school. So I think it was more of a clarifying of what questions I found most interesting, and those questions were largely metaphysical questions. That is, questions about the nature of reality, about the nature of possibility, the nature of value, the grounds for God in the world, right? It's often said through Heidegger, right, that the ultimate question of metaphysics is why there's anything at all. And I love that question. And I think there's better and worse answers to those kinds of questions. So I'm not sure it's any one question, but I will say the theological strain of my thinking has always been there. So I've wanted to be a theologian of deep philosophical roots and a philosopher of deep theological roots. And I wanted to see the interplay between these things. And so I'm not sure if any one question stands out. I will say that as I was emerging from that evangelical soil, travel played an important part in disrupting sort of my thinking, or at least giving me more questions to ask. So in college, for example, in 2009, I joined a study abroad program called Semester at Sea, where I lived on a ship for a semester's length of time and Your professors, your friends are on the ship with you. Your classes are on the ship, but the world is your campus. And so the journey is a circumambulation around the world, circumnavigation, visiting many, many different countries and synagogues, mosques, temples. I was in discussions with different thinkers and religious believers of all different kinds, and that was really expansive for me. So when I think of a moment or experience or even series of experiences, I think this element of travel has been so important in sort of knocking my mind open to the kinds of questions I could be asking with respect to the world's wisdom. Questions of religious pluralism, questions of how my understanding of God relates to that of others, and what, if anything, science can do to integrate and bring these things closer together based on data. So I'm not sure if that answers your question per se, but there's a lot of questions. It's hard for me to point to one that would break it open. Maybe the problem of evil, obviously, is a question that's disturbing for many evangelical kids. I saw a lot of things while traveling, right? I've been to Auschwitz, I've been to the Dalite village in India, Israel-Palestine going on. These are all areas that were a part of my journey and which raised these fundamental questions about the goodness of being, the goodness of God. Those questions stick with me, but I also think there's better and worse answers to those type of questions as well. So that's an indication, perhaps, of some of the questions.
Well, I'm seeing the soil that that this deeply philosophical work that you wrote, the Metaphysics of Exo-Life, which is, I mean, just if I were to show that to a congregant, they would say, I don't know what that book is about, because there's it's an academic work. But let me ask the question, why did you write this work, and what are you hoping that it accomplishes in the world?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think it's important for people to see that the question of other worlds and extraterrestrial life is not a new question. It's an ancient question, really. It goes back all the way to the ancient Greeks, and it's not even a new question for Christian faith, right? So that's important to see, that there's been a whole tradition of thinkers, theologians, philosophers who are asking about the scales and scope of creation, whether or not God might have created other beings of other kinds on other worlds. I think in the modern world, C.S. Lewis, right, at least on the evangelical side, is a portrait of that, right, who writes quite compellingly about other worlds and extraterrestrial life and their sort of theological relations. So, but specifically in the last, I'd say, decade or so, there's been a number of different books that have emerged that are seeking philosophical and theological responses to the impact of discovering extraterrestrial life. What would that mean for our current theologies? Are our theologies far too narrow and anthropocentric? Would it destroy theology, or would it stimulate us to evolve like other revolutions in science have? Quantum revolution, for example, the Darwinian revolution, Copernican revolution, all of which impacted theological thinking and religious thinking, but they're also stimuli to have that thinking evolve into new forms. So this book for me is by throwing my hat into the ring from the perspective of process philosophy and theology. The discussion, for the most part, over the last decade has neglected the resources of Whitehead and process thinkers, which I think is unfortunate, because process thought has been such an important force, at least in modern philosophy and theology, in the science and religion discussion. So I wrote this book principally as a critique of a certain approach, and that approach comes from Stephen J. Dick, a friend of mine. He's an astronomer and NASA's former chief historian. And Steve talks about how it is that theology must change. He believes theology must change quite a bit if we were to come in contact with extraterrestrial others. So he speaks of naturalistic cosmotheology as this alternative way of picturing God, which in reality, it's not quite a portrait of God. It's a sort of reduction of a certain image of God. But he's on the right track to the extent that theology would be impacted by this, and various thinkers are beginning to wonder about this. And so this book is my contribution to that conversation from the perspective of process philosophy and theology. Whitehead's thinking in particular. And last thing I'll say is that this book is a more narrower slice of a much larger project that has just come out now. And that is a book titled Astrophilosophy, Exo-Theology, and Cosmic Religion. And the subtitle of that is Extraterrestrial Life in a Process Universe. So we had a conference some years ago that brought a number of scholars together from NASA, scientists, philosophers, theologians, to ask about the relevance of process-style thinking to this emerging discussion. So that large volume was just published, and so we're beginning to see that there's more options available, I think, theologically and philosophically. And for me to make up for the neglect in process thinking in this discussion was really at the foundation of this book, in addition to enjoying Stephen Dick's work, which the book largely critiques. So, but I know it is an academic book. I know it's perhaps not one you'd share with your high school students per se, but there's other smaller articles I have on it too. I'd be happy to send those to you if those would be helpful.
Well, I did enjoy reading the book. It was a slower read, taking my time to process through. How would you're talking about Whitehead and process theology. So how would you define process theology to someone who's never heard it before?
Yeah, that is the great question that haunts us process thinkers. And yeah, we need to have the elevator pitch. So one way I think I often describe it to folks who ask about it is to say that process philosophy, process theology is committed to the notion that becoming, that change, that process is more fundamental than being, or that the world at its base and most fundamental form is verb-like rather than noun-like, right? So it's a worldview that prioritizes becoming, process, activity, creativity, and it reads that all the way down in nature and all the way up in nature. And, vertically, if you want, up to the level of a divine becoming, divinity that's related, that's in process with the world, that is intimately interconnected with what is going on in the world, that takes account of that and changes in the process. So I was just with a group last night, and that question came up, and the question was, well, how would you describe it to kindergarten students? And one way I think you can do that is by the distinction between a picture-like world and a movie-like world. Right? So I think we're all familiar with a single picture which freezes something that's active inherently so that you can grasp it, take hold of it, look at it. But in reality, it's just an abstraction from a fundamentally active movie-like experience. So I think that the differences between the picture that you look at and the movie that you watch, or indeed the movie that you participate in. So it's a deeply dynamic portrait of reality from top to bottom and from right to left.
The theologies that we hold to came out of a very medieval context, and even before medieval, but the creeds were written 400, between 3 and 500 AD. And then, all of the liturgies that we use and hold, and a lot of the theology is a contextualization of medieval worlds. And, we do not live in a medieval world anymore, but we have this understanding that the theology can't change, that it's like that, it's like that picture frozen in time of this is what theology, this is the theology that is for all time. And we just happen to take this picture back in the 1400s or something. But we have so many new questions, new philosophies, new understandings of the world around us. I mean, things have really changed, and they're changing fast. And it sounds like this process theology is something that can be a modern contextualization that'll help us think about God and theology a little bit better. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think this gets back to your point earlier about the importance of interdisciplinary thinking. Because science, philosophy, theology, these are distinct disciplines. At least they emerged eventually as distinct. They were much more amorphous in their ancient sort of renderings. But each of these disciplines adds something to the conversation. So it's certainly the case that when context changes, when knowledge changes, the theory should also change. Otherwise, we're just simply committed to concepts and notions of God, and we disregard experience. And I think that can be dangerous. It's sort of an interesting crisis in people's lives, and I have interest in people's spiritual narratives as well. It's like when your concept of God runs up against your experience and they conflict, then you're forced or faced with this interesting option. Either you hold on to your concept as a kind of idol and dismiss the experience, or you follow the experience, follow the new knowledge, and let your concept begin to evolve. And so I think process thought is very much into letting our concepts of God evolve. There are something that the medieval world got right. The philosophical and theological worldviews of the past are not, we should not completely dismiss them, but they can be updated, they can be deepened with the incoming knowledge that we now have. I mean, even in the last 30 years, I think it was 1993, we discovered the first exoplanet, right? The first extrasolar planet.
Yeah.
And after 30 years, we now have tallied 5,000 plus. We know we're not alone in a planetary sense. We know that evolution is not just a biological kind of phenomenon. It is this grand cosmic meta-narrative of the universe. And so what does that say about the God who created it, right? If we want to put it in that language, it must mean something and not nothing. And for us to remain relevant in our philosophical and theological thinking, we have to engage the best of our sciences and what they're revealing today. And I think it's a part of it's part of the honoring of truth to do so. There is no shortcut to truth, as Whitehead would say, and science, philosophy, and theology each have something to add to that discussion. So in a sense, it's like, science keeps philosophy, to the ground. Philosophy sort of keeps science honest, if you want. And then theology is a contextual base for making sense of the meaning and purpose of both endeavors. So I see a mutuality between these disciplines that I think needs to be emphasized.
I really like how you put those three things together into something. That was really interesting. And I mean, we just discovered an exoplanet in 93, which I remember that year. Like the understanding we have of the entire cosmos has changed. Like we didn't even know there was another galaxy out there until Hubble looked at the Andromeda Nebula, and he's like, wait a second, if I apply this mathematical concept, then that puts this really far outside of our galaxy, Milky Way galaxy. And we discovered the universe is larger than our Milky Way. And now with Webb and Hubble, it just seems like the universe is almost infinite, right? If our current theologies are to make sense of a medieval world, how does your work expand these theologies to include a broader cosmological understanding?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, just to your first comments there, I mean, it is remarkable what Hubble accomplished, and all of us have been appreciating Webb's new photos, right? So no doubt you've seen the sort of the HD version of the extreme deep field that Hubble originally took, and it's as if you're looking at stars, but you're not looking at stars. You're looking at galaxies, billions of galaxies. So I mean, I think it's absolutely plausible that the universe is infinite in scope. And I think there's resources historically in the past for affirming that. I think of Nicholas Cusa or poor Giordano Bruno, right, who in part suffered the consequences of saying, well, an infinite God would do nothing short of create infinitely. That the infinite cosmos is reflected in the infinite nature of God. And of course, he thought that we were certainly not the only populated planet, and was burned to the stake for that and other things at 1600.
Yeah.
Or Bruno.
We don't talk about Bruno.
So yeah. Well, it's just so important to see that ideas of the past that were so anathema are now absolutely welcomed on the theological scene, at least in the circles that I inhabit. So I mean, even Aquinas, it's important to see, said the universe could be infinite and eternal, and God would still be its creator, right? Because what creation is as a category it's not a chronological category. It's a relationship of logical priority, of which God is the prior, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
So I think process thought certainly is wanting to imagine a portrait of God that is utterly consistent with the infinite magnitude of the universe. And I think of Teilhard de Chardin, who's a great process thinker, next to Whitehead, one of the early, I'd say, pioneers of process thought, who really offers the how does he put it? I'm trying to remember his question. He says there's no doubt that we must begin to conceive a theology for these unknown worlds. So it's an early expression of a desire for a kind of exo-theology, wherein we're not the only planet, we're not the only galaxy. And of course, today we're hearing that we may not be the only universe, although that takes us into all sorts of different discussions as well. So I think theology is apt and ripe. We have the resources now to think creatively about this. And I personally think that, I've always thought this really, that theology is not simply a matter of finding out what's true and stating. I mean, it involves that in part. I think theology is an inherently creative endeavor. I think it's about expressing what is true in the most creative and beautiful possible way. So that's that sort of creative value dimension that's a part of creation itself. We're expression of this, after all. So I think, yeah, the infinite scales of the universe should be matched with a portrait of God that is large enough to incorporate them. And I think that's what we're attempting to do in a certain respect.
Yeah, I like to really, because I love science fiction, so I like to really nerd out on this kind of topic. But this is more than just nerding out on science fiction. Like, this is taking our theology and expanding it to our cosmological understandings, to the world we now inhabit, and making it relevant to new discoveries. And there's a there's a really funny Simpsons episode. Are you a Simpsons fan?
Yeah, I am.
Oh, there's a really funny Simpsons episode where those aliens land on the White House, like front lawn, and those octopus guys get out, and then everyone is like, "Oh my gosh, the aliens are here!" And the nerdy scientist guy comes in and he's like, this proves that God exists. And then the aliens do the sign of the cross and then start crying blasphemy, which is just hilarious.
That's great.
The Simpsons, like, they nailed so much early on, but to have kind of philosophical, theological fun, if extraterrestrials did land in our backyard, made themselves known, what theologies that we currently hold to would come into question or just become invalidated altogether, do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I remember that scene from The Simpsons. That's great. I actually forgot about that. I'm
It's one of my favorites.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So I think my immediate answer is that those theologies that operate from an anthropocentric, a starchly anthropocentric or anthropomorphic worldview, or even a terracentric worldview, meaning just earthbound, will require massive expanse. It's the case that I think of Teilhard again, who says, we need our Nicene Creed to be updated to face what does he say? To inhabit the cosmic face of the incarnation, right? So I think there's resources in our traditions for expanding our cosmic understanding. Again, the cosmic Christ is a part of the tradition, the summation of the cosmos itself, right? It's just that our notion of the cosmos is so vastly, vastly expanded. So to the extent that theologies and religions are earth-centric, human-centric, those will have a very hard time. But they don't have, it's not as if they lack the resources in the tradition to evolve, but they simply won't stand any longer if we are just going to assume that the cosmos is just simply about human beings or planet Earth, our salvation, the incarnation on one single planet. Whereas space is empty. Well, we know this is not true, and we have sort of jokes that are told about a planet hopping Jesus, right? Mm-hmm. Which maybe Family Guy and Simpsons and South Park are going to help us with in some way. So yeah, I think if that were to take place, anthropocentrism goes out the window, at least in its narrow and naive form. So does anthropomorphism and a terracentric or Earth-centered portrait of our significance and our meaning. We have to think of our meaning and significance religiously, theologically, at a cosmic scale and not just a planetary scale. At a terrestrial scale, it is just far too limited. We should think in an extraterrestrial direction, I think.
Like that whole Christ, the second coming of Christ is supposed to come back to Earth and establish the kingdom of God on Earth. That would be a terracentric, anthropomorphic, centric, I don't know if I hit that one right, theology. How would that need to evolve, do you think? What, using your best imagination?
Yeah, well, I mean, so I mentioned earlier a lot of the texts that are really exploding on this topic. And again, happy to share those resources with you, but it's not, the question of multiple incarnations is not necessarily a new question, right? So, but it's all the rage today when we think about, well, how can it be, say, that that the logos can inhabit only one world if there's infinite worlds potentially, or that Christ can return, and if that return means a literal return to only one world. So I just think we have to get more creative in our interpretive imaginations. The logos, there's no reason for the logos to be restricted to one form, one species form, or one planet alone, especially with all that we know. So I think the return of Christ could be understood in a much more cosmic sense, that is inclusive of all that's out there, as opposed to just one single planet. I mean, the idea that Christ would return physically just to planet Earth is also a very more narrow evangelical notion as well, right? So it's not at all obvious what the return of Christ would mean. And there may be more mystical cosmic ways of understanding that are fully consistent, I would suspect, with all that we know. So this is, I think, another case where doctrines are encouraged to expand beyond just traditional understandings. But I always want to emphasize that, I do think the resources are there, but it requires that imaginative creativity, theologically applied, that I've sort of been speaking of here. Mm-hmm. But what do you think about that? I mean, is the second coming? It's hard to say. We'd have to go into more with what that meant, but anyway.
Yeah, and that's one of those that I haven't thought enough about. I just have questions about that one, because growing up in a kind of that fundamental charismatic, watching Hagee and Van Impe and all of them, it was very spelled out what that's going to look like, when it's going to happen. Of course, they were wrong every damn time. But
I remember seeing billboards, when I was a student in San Diego. The end of the world is coming. Here's the date.
It keeps happening, and they keep being wrong. But there's like this decentering that I think, like, our cosmological understanding is decentering humanity from the mythologies that we've held on to. And by mythology, I mean shared narrative that gives meaning. We're being decentered by this scientific explosion of our understanding of the universe, but our mythologies have not kept up. And it seems like there is like an increase in loss of meaning to, that whole John Vervaeke's Crisis of Meaning comes to mind, his huge YouTube seminar. Like, we have lost meaning because we have lost that shared narrative, but it wasn't because, the enemy, Satan, came in and, lied to everybody. It's just we've exploded in our understanding of the cosmos, and it has decentered us, but now we don't have that shared narrative that gives us meaning. But you write that Whitehead seems to suggest, while we are going through a cosmological decentering, we can experience a metaphysical recentering. Could you kind of explain what that means and how that might help in this meaning crisis that we are in the midst of?
Wonderful question. Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, and I love John Vervaeke's work. I'm going to be on a panel with him actually at the end of March for an Ian McGilchrist conference.
Jealous. Okay.
Which you should attend. You could attend virtually. I can get you and listeners information about that.
Nice.
We are in a meaning crisis, and has many sort of roots, I might say. But yeah, let's go to that first distinction. Our cosmological decentering physically is a fact, right? So at one time we did think that, well, the Earth is the center and everything revolves around us, and it's all really about us, right? And so one could continually read the history of science as continual decenterings, right? And our cosmological decentering is just the opening door. There is our biological decentering, say with Darwin, or et cetera, right? And if we discovered the universe to be biological, that is, inhabited by many forms of life, that would be yet another kind of decentering, that we are not the only life in the universe. And so I think that all is fascinating. We need to come to terms with that. Whitehead and Teilhard encourage theology to incorporate this decentering, and yet they do not read that decentering in a nihilistic direction. So we often see that, right? We're not the center of the universe. We're just on the periphery. We're an insignificant planet. Therefore, it's all sort of meaningless, and we are not significant. I think that's an interpretive philosophical jump that doesn't need to happen. So what Whitehead allows us to say is that although we are cosmologically decentered, because we are every bit a part of the universe and what it's ultimately up to, we have to see ourselves as metaphysically central. So when we begin to ask about this universe and what it's up to, we have no other perspective from which to operate than our own experience. And so I think it's a beautiful dimension of Whitehead's thought to say that you are not an exception to this universe. You are an exemplification of its deepest nature and its structure. To use this soil metaphor, right?
Wow.
We are a plant that has grown out of the soil of the universe. We are a product of what the universe is doing. And when we begin to see that, our experience is well, a part of us. It's more than us. It's connected to the vast unfolding cosmos of which we are part. I do think a sense of belonging can reemerge. So to the extent the meaning crisis is linked in feelings of isolation, feelings of decentering from each other, from God, from the universe itself, I think it helps to remind us that there is nothing else that we can be but this universe expressing itself. And that this universe includes experience, it includes value, it includes mind, it includes possibilities. After all, we were possibilities harbored in the womb of the universe before we came to be. Those possibilities were not dependent on us, right? The universe labored to bring creatures like us into being. So, to be comedic, it's not the size that counts, right? We may be very small, we may be on the cosmological periphery, but that alone does not signify meaninglessness, okay? So I do think it's important to stress that we are the most intimate part of the world that we know, and we know it from the inside. And that's where we start when we think about what this universe is up to. Rather than saying, well, the universe just happens to throw up life and mind here and there. It's like, no, these are possibilities in the nature of things. Why are they there? And there's possibilities for things so that when the time is right, they can birth out of the soil. So I do think that rethinking our relationship to the universe is going to be a part of solving this meaning crisis. That's not the only thing, right? But from the largest possible scale, which is sort of where we're talking, we are an expression of this cosmos. We didn't fall into it from somewhere else. We grew out of it as a plant out of soil, and that means something about our significance. It means something about what this universe is up to. And I think, personally, the idea that we can magically extend this to other realms where other beings of experience and value are also potentially asking these kinds of questions is just an adventurous and worthwhile thought. So that's all to say that I think a sense of belonging reemerges when we see ourselves not only as cosmologically decentered, but as metaphysically recentered. That philosophy begins in the analysis of our experience. Experience belongs in this universe, and we are its expression. So as Alan Watts once said, just as an apple tree apples, it seems that the universe peoples, right? It produces sort of people. So Does that help?
Yeah.
I mean, I wonder what you think about that. This loss of belonging in the universe. I know the meaning crisis is much wider than that. It's sort of pragmatic and practical means of
Well,
reorienting ourselves.
I think you just gave us at least a starting point. It doesn't construct a shared narrative in a
Yeah,
community that would give us a sense of meaning and purpose yet, but that's the starting place to do so, I think. And
yeah,
with the loss of the shared narrative of, um, you know, the Bible literally describes everything. You went all the way back to, the when we thought the Earth was the center of the universe, and now we've been slowly decentering ourselves. And it seems
hmm
like we're in this process of a severe humbling where we are being
nice.
decentered and decentered and decentered. And then we try to reframe our centeredness
Yeah,
in the decentered. Well, how do we make sense of our centeredness now? Well, let's put ourselves at the center. Maybe we're not physically at the center of the universe, but we're spiritually at the center of the universe. And God becomes a human and redeems humans and establishes the kingdom of God, on earth among
hmm
humans, everything. And so we're experiencing this severe humbling that goes through where we are being decentered, but then keep recentering ourselves. And I think this metaphysical recentering is a way of humbly embracing recentering
Yeah,
in our understanding of ourselves in this universe.
I
So,
really like the way you put that. Yeah, it's a um, yeah, cosmological humility, right?
yeah.
Cosmological humbling. Um, but just to a little bit more, like I think of somebody like Neil deGrasse Tyson, who in the popular science world they often make these passing comments that are just sort of annoying to me. Like he had a tweet exchange with Norm Macdonald, the former comedian, and Tyson tweeted out, he said, "The world is blind to our sorrows and indifferent by our pains. Have a nice day." That's all it said, right? Presumably a liberating comment. And McDonald responded, I'll just sort of paraphrase here, but in a brilliant way, saying, uh, Neil, you can't basically take yourself out of the universe as if though you're completely different from it, right? His statement assumes that he is not part and parcel of this universe and what it's doing, right? Because we are hardly the kinds of beings that are indifferent by pain, that are, at least those are the moral faults of our species, right? But we're not the kind of species that are indifferent. Even this statement, have a nice day, it is not an indifferent statement, but it's uttered in the universe. It's uttered even by the universe. So I just think we need to, and Whitehead critiques, our tendency in philosophy and theology too, to abstract ourselves from the picture, to then make a conclusion about the larger narrative and forget to put ourselves back in it. So I think across the board, science needs to recognize, again, that we're part and parcel of this universe. We're not bifurcated from it. And so Whitehead has a beautiful statement that I read in terms of belonging cosmologically, where he says, our experience, dim and fragmentary as it is, yet sounds in the utmost depths of reality. Right? It's sort of a beautiful sense that we belong here. If we didn't, we would not exist. If we weren't part and parcel and connected intimately with what this universe is doing, we simply wouldn't be here, and yet we are. And that's quite fascinating to me. Right. So I want to continue to explore this sense of belonging in my work, and I hope to do that, publicly as best I can as well, because I think it's important. To cosmologically belong is no small sense of belonging.
Yeah.
Yeah. And maybe we start there. Maybe that's the largest frame in which we start with to rethink the modern myth that we are somehow not expressive of what this universe is doing.
I think that is, that gives us that wonderful starting place of we belong here. And, with the rise of existentialism, and now everyone has to find their own unique purpose in the world. It's like,
right.
Even, and the church is like critical of that, but then, we have Purpose-Driven Life is is the second best-selling, and that's a existential religious work.
Yeah.
There has been like this disenchantment that's been happening since Luther said the bread isn't really bread. is just bread,
Mm-hmm.
where we've been thinking of the world in this mechanistic way, where nouning it, I guess, everything becomes a noun. That is,
Good.
and it's disenchanted a lot of the world around us, where everything can be explained as a noun.
Mm-hmm.
And there seems to be no magic, no spiritual, um, no enchantment left, because science, quote, explains everything. And then, theology follows suit, and we're explaining everything there is about God. But
Yeah.
you kind of explain that quantum physics has revealed the nature of the world not as mechanistic and dead, but more of like revealing the nature of the world as fluid and relational and energetic. How could this understanding re-enchant the world from that mechanistic 17th century thinking to something more relational and connected?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, like you were saying about the thinging of the world, right? This noun-based world. I think also of Ian McGilchrist's recent book is titled "The Matter with Things," and
Mm,
it's sort of a double entendre because what's the matter with things? There's clearly a lot of things the matter, and part of the matter with things is our obsession with barren matter and static things, right?
yeah.
And it's no wonder that we become disenchanted when we view the world this way, since it's so utterly foreign to who and what we are, right? It's inconsistent with our own experience. Um, and the consequences are disastrous. We see that in different environmental ways, ecological ways, ethical ways. Far be it from us to treat somebody as simply a thing, right? An it. Rather, this is a more I thou, as Buber would tell us. But it is the case that science deals in metaphors, and the mechanistic metaphor, um, where things are externally related, and automata in a certain way, determined in their being and their essence, it served its purpose for a while, right? This was the foundation of the Cartesian Newtonian physics, and philosophy incorporated it, and theology incorporated it. But it is a relic. It emerged out of a much more mystical, magical vision of a universe that is utterly alive. I think of Hans Jonas, who has a brilliant, brilliant book, the Jewish existential philosopher, called The Phenomenon of Life. And he makes this curious observation that, back in the day, it was just taken for granted that everything was alive. Therefore, death was the problem. Whereas nowadays, we've inverted this and we think that everything is dead and life is the problem.
Mm,
Life emerged. How do we make sense of that?
holy cow.
So I think that what we see in this transition from the mechanistic to what I call more organic worldview is based upon the data of the sciences. The quantum revolution has done away with the notion that we are constructed out of insentient bits of dead matter. And that's a good thing, because how on earth would life and experience emerge from simply dead and sentient matter? It's shown us that energy is pervasive and fundamental and apparently eternal, right? And so what is at the base of all this? It is deep interconnection. It is a much more organic picture as opposed to mechanistic picture. And I think that what it adds to us with respect to this question of disenchantment is a certain through line from who we are to what the universe is itself. So again, to say that we are metaphysically recentered doesn't mean that we're the most important, but it means we have to take the data of our experience seriously, because that's the only place we can start when thinking about what this universe is up to. We are creatures of creativity. We are not utterly determined in our actions, despite some philosophers wanting to argue that.
Mm-hmm.
And we are concerned with value. In fact, the content of our experience, as Whitehead would say, is the feeling tones of value. We are concerned with possibilities, what can be, right? We've awoken to conscious experience which discriminates between past, present, and future. So these are all things that exceed what I think a mechanistic metaphor can allow for. And we need to change our metaphors. And I think today many are speaking about the world as an organism. An organism grows. An organism, it's related to the soil we've been talking about. It has its own self-creativity. It has its own possibilities wedded to its nature. And moreover, I think this is relevant to our image of God as well, because the clockwork God of the mechanistic universe is operating from the outside, right? In its worst form, the deistic form, God sets the universe going from the outside and just runs on its own because it's like a determined machine. But how does our image of God change when the universe is a growing organism and God is growing with it? Right? This element of growth, of interiority, of intrinsic value. These are all new notions that belong to a much more organic conception of reality. And I think it can re-enchant our perspectives because it's more consistent with how we experience our world. I think we are at a fault when we treat each other mechanically, when we treat the world mechanically. And we need to find a better way of living and being that is consistent with the ways the universe actually are. And I think there's a place for that in both philosophy and religion. I think science has helped us come to those conclusions as well. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, well, it's got me thinking about, you said that energy is eternal. And this whole quantum thing is just so odd. When you look at how things operate on a quantum level, it's like Newton doesn't apply anymore. And, this one particle is behaving in one way until you look at it, and now it's behaving in a totally different way. And, you can have one particle, here and one particle on the other end of the Milky Way and switch one, the direction it's spinning, and the other one does simultaneously. It's almost like distance doesn't even matter. And it's just, it does seem in one end scientific and on another end like deeply enchanted, that there's just something about the energetic relational aspect of things in this unseen realm, whether it's purely science or whether there's spirit or whether it's I don't know. It's just fun to think about, and I think that it is giving ourselves permission to think about these things in ways that are not consigned to, well, this is what my theology has told me that I'm allowed to think of, or even on the other end, this is what science has allowed me to think about, and I can't break out of the cages. This interdisciplinary mix and mesh of psychology, philosophy, and theology, that you're exploring. I think it just gives us permission to say this world is a deeply enchanted place that is really hard to understand. There's lots of things we can't understand, and it's almost like our understanding keeps expanding, but it's almost like swimming out to sea. We're making a lot of progress, but man, it gets deeper as we go. And there's so much more left unexplored as we go forward. And it is a severe, humbling thing. And I think that itself is a re-enchantment. To just say, I don't know. Here I am. I'm making great progress in understanding new things, but it's also revealed 10 things I don't know. It's like,
and there's that, it's wonderful. There's that cosmological humility again.
Yeah.
But as you're speaking, it occurred to me too that the dominant narrative, the dominant scientific narrative, is often assumed to be, often assumes that meaningless is just our default assumption when it comes to the universe, right? But it's not just that philosophy and theology give us permission. I like that language, but science gives us permission too. When you look at the emergence of the quantum worldview, the quantum revolution, I mean, all of the pioneer thinkers like Heisenberg and Planck and Eddington and James Jeans, Whitehead, certainly others, there's a mystical strain in their thinking. These are not reductive materialists. These are not nihilists. These are people who are giving us permission to wonder with them. These are people of deep humility, right? And so I just think that's important to emphasize, because we're stuck in the idea that science is prescribing a certain way of looking at the world. Well, it does to a certain extent. The idea that is a meaningless portrait, to me, is just false. Scientists and faith, scientists and mysticism has been an important discussion, even in the emergence of the modern quantum world. And I just think we don't want to lose sight of that. for a more holistic picture, to say that we have permission, not just through philosophy, theology, but through multiple domains of discourse, and especially science. We have to remain humble, but we have permission to think and connect and wonder. I mean, a lot of Eddington, all these the figures I mentioned, a lot of them thought that mind has a fundamental place in the universe. Of course, they disagreed on how to express that, but the universe wasn't mindless. After all, we're minds. We emerged, right? Mind belongs in some sense. But a lot of them held to, or at least speculated about, the ultimate place of consciousness in the universe. And scientists at their best today are doing the same. And they're informed by various points of empirical data. So it is a really exciting time. There's much to be re-enchanted about. This is not a meaningless universe. And if somebody affirms that, they may have experiences of meaning or meaninglessness, but even that only happens in the context of the spectrum of meaning, more or less, the spectrum of value. So again, we do not want to take ourselves out of this universe. There are purposes, there are greater and lesser values to be attained, possibilities to be actualized. And this is what we're trying to do, I think, in some respect, with our different disciplines. And it seems to be what the universe is up to as well, exploring these magnitudes of possibility. And I think the meaning question, the re-enchantment question, is important for me. And I get the question sometimes, well, what am I supposed to be up to in the universe? And I think what we're supposed to be up to in the universe is what the universe is up to in us. I think we're an expression of value, possibility, and experience in this universe. And I think it's our privilege to attempt to further that business more so. The actualization of value, the addition of goodness, of truth, of beauty, which is these values that are intimately wedded even to science. Like Whitehead says, science cannot even get off the ground without judgment to value. Value is more fundamental than even the scientific endeavor, right? So again, you see me returning to this notion of not making a distinction between ourselves and what's happening in our experience in the universe and what it's doing. I want to bring these back together, and I think that's a part of the mystical scientific tradition.
If we are in this like severe humbling, and we are de-anthrocentricizing our faith, that would be decentering humans from the faith. When the Christian tradition is based upon the incarnation of God becoming human, what kind of theological problems might we run into when we de-anthropomorphize, that's a really long word, God. And we still have this central tenet to the faith that says that God became a human in the person of Christ. Did I ask that question clear enough?
Sure.
It's in my head clear.
Sure.
I don't know if it came out clear.
Yeah, no. No, I mean, it is a good question. And, of course, the Christian tradition has always recognized that God, the scope of creation is not just human, right? We know that even in the Genesis narratives. There's other creatures of unimaginable diversity on this planet alone. I mean, when you look at the intelligence of an octopus in the ocean, it's almost as if you're looking at an extraterrestrial being, right? Mm-hmm. So the scales of life and intelligence could be so utterly vast and different. But of course, human beings are distinct, right? So this notion that we're in the image of God, variously understood, is an important one for the tradition. And this is also an important one for the conversation surrounding exophilosophy, astrophilosophy. What does it mean to be the image of God? Could there be other planets with other creatures that are also sharing in the divine image? So I think these have remained sort of open questions. The incarnation is a restricted, more anthropocentric claim, because we're saying that we're a particular species that God also inhabited and dwelt. And so I just think that what we're required to do in this cosmological humbling is to loosen the shackles on our understanding of the incarnation, right? What really is wrong with the notion that the infinite reality of God can become incarnate in whatever kind of species form that demands it or that makes it possible, right? So the idea, it's not just a silly notion of a planet hopping Jesus, right? That's sort of a comedic reduction, which I enjoy. But the idea that God's desire, at least from a process philosophical framework, but even arguably from the Christian tradition, is to become incarnate, right? And that the faith process, the faith journey, is one in which we make that more or less possible from happening, right? And so you imagine somebody like Jesus on this particular planet, living in such a way, being transparent in such a way to this universe, to God, wherein the full incarnation of God became possible. But why should we say that God is confined to Jesus? Let's instead say that Jesus defines God, but does not confine God. Let's not confine God to our planet. Let's not confine God to a single religion. Let's say that God instead is defined in certain ways within these traditions, but not confined by them. I think when we do that, we allow the face of the incarnation of various creeds of Christian faith, especially of creation, to be much more vast in scope. God is up to far more than one planet and one species that have been around just for a small twinkle of an eye. Again, that doesn't make us worthless. I think that should humble us. It's this cosmological humbling again, and make us excited to imagine what else the divine reality might be up to in other places, and not just other cultures on our planet. Because it's not as if God only works in first century Palestine, right? God is at work across the world we inhabit. And where those worlds are multiplied to the nth degree, we must also say that God inhabits and is working there. So I just think it requires more creative theology, creative expansion. Anyway, what do you think about that?
I like how Jesus can define but not confine. That was really helpful thought. Where I think the thing that confines God to Jesus instead of defines is the understandings of sin and atonement that we have that make it necessary that God come and then absorb the wrath of God in the person of Jesus for our benefit, because we have to make sense of original sin and why Christ had to come and die. So I think that confining God to Jesus is because we've put the theologies over top of that are very much necessary to take care of the problems that we've theologically created for ourselves of sin and atonement. I think
that's well put. Yeah, well, I think that this atonement soteriology discussion too is also an important one, even in this larger cosmological discussion that we're wedded in here. For example, some have wanted to say, well, and Teilhard again raised this question, supposing there's a planet that has not fallen into original sin, are they now in no need of the incarnation? Well, but not every Christian persuasion affirms the notion of original sin, right? This is an Augustinian Western notion. The Eastern Church does not have this notion in the same way at all. Right. So the stimulus for incarnation shouldn't be a contingent doctrine of one Western side of the church, right? I think what we have to say is that this aim for redemption, for salvation, for incarnation belongs essentially to the nature of God. That this is what God aims to be up to in the world. And that where we see chief expressions of this is where we have awoken to that and align it with who we are and what we're doing. And I think we see Jesus as the primordial or primary expression on this planet, at least Christians will say that, of the image of God, right? It's what we can see of God in a human form. Supposing we transport ourselves elsewhere, there's no telling what we can see of God in another form. But I think what we have to say as Christians is that it'll be consistent with what we've seen of God on this planet. And I think that through line of consistency needs to be there because we're dealing with the activity of the one infinite God.
I was listening to Avi Loeb. I think it was Avi Loeb on a podcast. He's a Harvard scientist that I enjoy some of his thoughts. He thinks this way is also outside of a Christian context, but he thinks larger thoughts in a scientific realm. And, the question was posed to him, if extraterrestrials did show up, would they just automatically assume that we were the most intelligent forms of life on the planet, or would they be conversing with the trees or the whales? It's like, and that was a major decentering process for me, where I was like, I just always assumed that they would show up and say, oh, but what if they did show up and say, what are all these mammals running around ruining the planet for? Let's go talk to the whales and see what they say. That's a radical decentering right there.
Absolutely. Avi's work is really, really interesting. I've listened to a lot of his podcasts too. Seems like just a fun guy to talk to as well. Yeah. You should have him on if you can. But yeah, no, I mean, I think it's that again is a decentering, because it's as if we, presumably highly intelligent beings, are not even aware of what's possible for us in our relationships with our own planet. Mm-hmm. There's a deeply ecological sort of dimension to this, that there may be ways of connecting, of being, of inhabiting, and listening, communicating with this planet that we're not even aware of, and that a species that is presumably superior in some form would have that ability to do so. You've seen Avatar, I'm sure, right? And you remember these scenes of just deep connection with the home tree and the planet, and it's just sort of a beautiful image of what potentially could be, if we could sort of break free of these mechanistic shackles. This notion that we're the cream of the crop, and really nature has instrumental value, not intrinsic value. Right? It's value to be used for our benefit, not value in and of itself. Yeah. And so I like the idea that a tree has a form of coordinated experience. It won't be like ours, right? But it may be like something. I grew up in the redwoods of Occidental, just a half hour away, and I used to see the trees sort of swaying in the wind, being warmed by the sun, and wondering if they're enjoying that. Right? This element of enjoyment, of value. At least for Whitehead, this element of enjoyment, of value, goes all the way down to nature is the storehouse of intrinsic value, not just instrumental value. So I think that it may be that if we ever come in contact with other beings, we have possibilities of spiritual advancement that are hard to imagine. So I don't necessarily take the view of Hawking or others who say, well, we live in a dark forest, right? And everyone's a hunter hiding behind a tree, and the first thing they're going to do when they see somebody else is blow them away. There's an element of that in the universe, at least on this planet. But if we come in contact with other beings, it may be in the context of spiritual contact rather than hostility, and the idea that we should just project the hostility of our planet onto the universe itself is also a big move. It may be that our planet has the problematic notion that the larger spiritual frame is actually what the universe is up to, and the idea that other beings can awaken to that and inhabit that in ways far more advanced than us is an imaginative thought. People often say, well, we don't know if technological civilizations are going to survive the bottleneck, right? They ultimately end up destroying themselves. Well, if there are species out there who have not destroyed themselves, that got through that bottleneck, I think the only way they could do that is through a spiritual recentering of some kind. And it may be that we meet them on behalf of that, and not just hostility of resources. Yeah. So these are very complicated questions and a lot of implications, but it's just imaginative. It's hard to think about.
Yeah. Well, maybe before
extraterrestrial spiritual life.
Yes. Maybe before we meet the aliens and they can tell us how to be better, maybe we could start conversing with who's actually here. And, that
would be a good place to start.
Really look at the, nature around us, the trees and the ecological systems, and say, what you said is not, it's not an instrument for us to just use as, modern capitalistic expressions have made nature, but more of this is the ecology we inhabit. How are we a part of this system, and how can we better fit into this system? And I think these conversations that we're having can help us, at least give us imagination to have those easier conversations that are before us in the present day. And the writings that you've done here, I think it's so fun to look out, 100 years from now, or, the possibilities of, extraterrestrials being found and communicating with us. But we also have a world that we inhabit. There's birds out. We have a bird feeder right outside my bedroom window here, and they're an intelligence. The trees, they're an intelligence. The fungi systems are an intelligence. It's just, what would happen if we had this decentering happened in the present, not just when aliens told us that we weren't central, but if we took the humility to the logical place that we can today and just say, we're not the center of this earth. We are an ecological part of the relationship that this earth is. I think that could be, and I think your book helps us have conversations that are that practical, because it opens our imaginations.
But I think what you're getting at too, it's not as if, we want to wait for aliens to tell us what to do. Like, this is where I think the spiritual disciplines are, theological and mystical traditions, the prescribing of practice, that's a part of our traditions, right? Not just orthodoxy, but orthopraxy can help us do this, right? This sort of metaphor of waking up, of being recentered. It's not as if our species has not found avenues of doing that better than, say, our modern world would allow. So I think we're in a time where we need to rediscover modes of practice that attune us to the majesty of being, the uniqueness of who we are and who this planet, who this planet is, Gaia, maybe, right? And all its intricacies, its intelligence from bottom to top. So I think that element of practice and discipline is important. I think people need to adopt a spiritual practice. I've wanted to do that more so in my life, right? So I do a lot of study, a lot of theory, and that there's a lot of theory in this book and debate. But in the end, we have to live it out somehow. And to do so is to honor the ancient roots of what philosophy is. It's not just an armchair discipline. It was meant for the guiding of our life, for happiness, for awareness, for authenticity, right? So these are the original roots of philosophy. That's why recently I've become much more interested, actually in connection with this psychology program, my Munich colleagues, in exploring philosophical practice, what that would mean, and indeed philosophical counseling, which is a movement that's taking place now, which applies the wisdom and the insights of philosophical discourse to the betterment of practical situations, the practical betterment of life. And so I seek to inhabit that. I like to have the theory, but also want to implement the practice. And I think the bridge between the two is often difficult, but we have examples of that all throughout our traditions. So I think we should explore that more.
I think so. And this conversation has helped me explore that. I've had ideas and thoughts and questions that are fun to have, but then, there's like, okay, but I still have to make dinner today, and snow blow my driveway today, and these are all connected. So, gosh, thank you for just helping me think through some things and coming on the podcast. It's just, this conversation has been as fun as I hoped it was going to be. How can people connect with your work and your book? Where you want them to go?
Yeah, well, thanks, Tom. I hope we get a chance to talk again. Yeah, I've enjoyed it as well. So you can go to andrewmdavis.info, which is my website. I keep that updated with upcoming events and conferences. So Metaphysics of Exo-Life, I have links there to Amazon. The larger tome of which it's a part is also available now. Also on the site, I hope you all will subscribe to my YouTube channel as well. It's where I try to update things and new videos, new lectures, new ideas. And stay in touch with me. Questions, comments. I love to keep conversations going either through my website or through the Center for Process Studies, and be happy to continue that conversation on these or other themes.
Awesome. Well, we'll put those links in the notes of the show and send people your way.
I appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. This was such a fun conversation.
It really was. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for listening to the Liminal Living podcast. I hope this conversation sparked some imagination in you, helped you find your place within the narrative that God is writing, even though you may have been made to feel like you're outside of that narrative. You are not. You are included. And if this conversation was helpful for you, could you do me a favor? Could you please share it with someone who's at least half as nerdy as you are? Possibly leave a review on whatever podcast platform you're listening on. Rate, subscribe. Make sure you subscribe so you can stay up to date on where we're going. So, with all those things said and done, we will see you next week where we talk with podcaster friend of mine, Josh Patterson, about the church and where it's going in all the good ways and in all the bad ways. I think you'll like that conversation as well. So until then, peace out. Maybe listen to this podcast 2 or 3 more times so you can absorb the nerdiness of Dr. Andrew Davis. Peace out.
Whether you're a morning person or a bedtime procrastinator, everyone deserves a mattress that works for their style. And you'll find the best mattress for you at Ashley. The new Temper-Adapt collection at Ashley brings you one-of-a-kind body-conforming technology, making every sleep tailored to be your best. The collection also features cool-to-the-touch covers and motion absorption to help minimize sleep disruptions from partners, pets, or kids. Shop the all-new Temper-Adapt collection at Ashley, in-store or online at ashley.com. Ashley, for the love of home.